At 32, Thomas had built a life of silence. The Colorado mountains were his only real neighbor, and conversations were as rare as a warm day in January. But loneliness is a patient hunter. It had finally cornered him. That's why he was standing on a frozen train platform, waiting for a woman he'd never seen. He'd written to a matrimonial agency. A simple letter from a simple man. "I work hard," he wrote. "Own land. I don't need beauty, just kindness." He didn't ask for a photograph. The mountains taught him that the prettiest things could be the most dangerous, and real value was usually hidden deep beneath the surface. Her reply was elegant. Her name was Margaret. She had no family, and she longed for the quiet life he described. She would come on the October train, she said, if he'd have her. Now October was here. The whistle of the 347 cut through the air, and Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. The great iron beast hissed to a stop, steam clouding the platform like a ghost. Passengers got off, a businessman, an old woman, a family with kids, and then he saw her. Margaret stepped down from the train, and the world stopped. She was not what he had expected. Not at all. His mind had pictured someone small, maybe frail, someone seeking protection. But the woman walking toward him needed no protection. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, with shoulders broad enough to carry the world. Her dress was clean, but it strained across a frame that had never known a hungry day. She was, by any measure, twice his size. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The storm clouds gathering overhead seemed to pause, waiting. "Mr. Mitchell?" Her voice was soft, musical, a strange and gentle sound coming from such a powerful figure. "Yes, ma'am. That's me." His own voice was a rough growl. She smiled then, a small, hopeful thing. "I'm Margaret. I hope I'm not too different from what you imagined." The fear in her voice hit him harder than a physical blow. This woman had traveled 1,000 miles, bet her whole life on him, on a stranger. "No, ma'am," he heard himself say, the words feeling truer than anything he'd ever said. "You're exactly what I needed." But as they walked toward the town's small church, a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He'd sent for a wife, but he had the terrifying feeling he'd summoned a force of nature instead. The walk to the church was silent. Every footstep on the wooden sidewalk felt like a drum beat counting down to a mistake. Thomas could feel eyes on them from every window, could practically hear the whispers that would fuel town gossip for the next year. This wasn't what anyone expected. As they walked, Margaret began to hum. It was a strange, haunting tune that seemed to settle the air around them. "My mother used to sing that," she said softly, "when storms were coming." Thomas looked up. The sky was a bruised purple. Seems fitting, then. The church doors felt heavy, like he was pushing open the gate to his own doom. Pastor Williams stood at the altar, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. He was a man who'd seen all kinds of desperate pairings on the frontier. He didn't judge. He just did his job. "Shall we proceed?" the pastor asked. Margaret nodded, but Thomas saw the tremor in her hands as she set her bag down. For all her size, she was just as scared as he was. They stood at the altar. The pastor's words washed over them, words spoken 1,000 times in this very room. "Do you, Thomas Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas looked at Margaret, at her strong jaw, her intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He thought of his empty cabin, of the crushing silence. "I do." The words were louder than he expected. "Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She looked right into his eyes, and he saw it then. Not just hope, not just fear. He saw a fierce, unbreakable determination, a resolve that had clearly carried her through hell and deposited her right here, in front of him. "I do." At that exact moment, thunder crashed overhead. It wasn't a rumble. It was a cannon shot that shook the little church to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows, a sudden, violent assault. The storm was here. "By the power vested in me," the pastor hurried, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Thomas hesitated. This was all wrong, but Margaret stepped toward him, her hand touching his cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible. "It's all right," she whispered. We're both scared. He kissed her. It was brief and soft and tasted of hope and rain. As they left the church, the world outside was a churning chaos of wind and water. He'd married a stranger in the middle of a tempest. He realized with a sinking feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one he had just invited into his life. The rain was coming down in sheets. The 20-mile journey to his cabin was impossible. There's a boarding house, he shouted over the wind. We can wait it out there. Margaret just nodded, pulling her shawl tight. As they fought their way through the mud and rain, Thomas noticed something else. She moved with an unnatural grace. Her steps were sure, her balance perfect. This wasn't a city woman. This was someone who knew hardship, who knew how to move through a hostile world without falling. The boarding house was warm and dry. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, gave them a room with a knowing look in her eye. She'd seen it all. The room was small, one bed, one chair, a canyon of awkwardness between them. I can sleep on the floor, Thomas said quickly. Nonsense. Margaret's voice was firm. We're married. Besides, she added, her voice dropping, I've slept in worse places. The way she said it sent a chill down his spine. Where did you come from, Margaret? Really? She was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the rain against the glass. I worked in a factory, she said finally, in Chicago, 12 hours a day making buttons. She held up her hands and he saw the faint scars. My parents died in a fire. I lost everything. The story was simple, tragic. It should have explained everything. But it didn't. It felt rehearsed. And when I read your letter, she continued, pulling the worn paper from her bag, you wrote about quiet and mountains. It sounded like paradise. Another crash of thunder, softer this time. I should tell you, she said, her voice barely a whisper, I'm not what men call beautiful. The men at the factory, they called me Big Maggie. The pain in her voice was real. It cut through his suspicion. You want to know what I see? He said, turning to the window. I see someone brave enough to travel 1,000 miles alone. I see someone who worked 12 hours a day and didn't break. I see someone strong enough for the mountains. Her eyes filled with tears. When I saw your face on that platform, she whispered, I was afraid you'd send me back. Where would you have gone? Nowhere, she said. I used my last dollar for the train ticket. The raw vulnerability of it shattered his remaining defenses. This woman had bet everything on him, on his kindness. Margaret, he said, I didn't ask for a photograph because I was afraid too. Afraid you'd see me and change your mind. They were two lonely people, backed into a corner by life. We don't know each other, he said. No, she agreed. This might not work. It might not. But we're here, she finished, and we're both tired of being alone. He sat on the edge of the bed, the distance between them still there. Tell me about home, she said. But as they talked through the night, a new thought took root in his mind. She said she was running from a life of poverty, but her elegant speech, her regal bearing, the strange, sad songs she hummed, they didn't belong to a factory worker. She was running from something, all right, but it wasn't poverty, and he was beginning to think he'd made a terrible mistake. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean. They loaded Margaret's few belongings into the wagon, a small trunk, a sewing basket, and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth that she handled like it was precious gold. The journey home was quiet. Thomas had expected her to be intimidated by the raw, empty wilderness. Instead, she seemed to relax. The farther they got from civilization, the more the tension left her shoulders. It was like she was coming home. When they finally crested the ridge and his valley spread out below, she gasped. It's beautiful, she said, like the world was just born. The cabin was small, built for one. He saw it now through her eyes, cramped, rough, lonely. It's not much, he said, helping her down. It's perfect, she breathed, and he knew she meant it. But as she moved inside, a new kind of tension filled the small space. How could two lives, especially two lives as different as theirs, fit in this tiny box? I've lived in a room half this size for 2 years, she said, sensing his worry. This is a palace. Thomas watched, amazed as she began to unpack. She didn't rearrange his life. She simply found the empty spaces and settled into them. Her dress on a peg next to his coat, her brush on the stand next to his razor. It felt right. She placed the wrapped bundle on the mantel. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. Inside were a few books, a small faded photograph of a woman who looked just like her, and a packet of letters. "She was beautiful," Thomas said, looking at the picture. "She was strong," Margaret corrected. "Beauty fades. Strength endures." But as she put the items away, something slipped from the folds of the oilcloth and fell to the floor with a soft thud. It was a knife, not a kitchen knife, but a small, wicked-looking dagger with a carved bone handle. She snatched it up before he could get a good look, her face pale. She quickly hid it away in her trunk, but the image was burned into his mind. What kind of factory worker carried a weapon like that? The ease between them vanished. The questions came roaring back. Who was this woman? What danger had she fled that was so great she needed to carry a hidden blade 1,000 miles into the wilderness? That night, the silence in the cabin wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, filled with secrets. He lay awake for hours, listening to her steady breathing, wondering if he was sharing his home with a fugitive, or worse. 3 days later, the mountains decided to test her. Thomas woke before dawn to find Margaret staring out the window, her body rigid. "What is it?" A massive black bear was in his vegetable garden, tearing it to shreds. It was a huge male, angry and unafraid. This was their winter food supply. "Does this happen often?" Her voice was calm, but he could hear the steel beneath it. "Sometimes." He reached for his rifle. This was his job, to protect, to provide. But Margaret grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said. "Let me." Before he could argue, she was out the door. His heart stopped. The bear was 3 times her size. It could kill her with a single swipe. "Margaret!" he yelled, his hand on the rifle. She held up a hand, demanding silence. She walked toward the bear. Slow, deliberate. Her hands were empty and open where the bear could see them. When she was 30 feet away, she began to sing. It was the same haunting melody he'd heard on their wedding day. But this time there were words, spoken in a language he'd never heard, low and rhythmic. The bear stopped its destruction. It looked up, its small, dark eyes fixed on her. It huffed, a low warning sound. But Margaret didn't stop. Her voice grew stronger, weaving a strange spell in the cold morning air. For what felt like an eternity, the woman and the beast just looked at each other. Then the bear grunted, shook its massive head, and ambled back into the forest. Margaret stood for a moment more before turning and walking back to the cabin, as if she'd just been shooing a stray dog. How? How did you do that?" Thomas stammered. The rifle felt useless in his hands. "My father worked in lumber camps," she said simply, not meeting his eye. "He taught me that most animals don't want trouble." It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. The way she had faced that bear wasn't something you learned in a lumber camp. It was something ancient, something innate. He looked at the ruined garden. "Winter's coming," she said, her voice practical again. "We need to focus on storing what's left, not on what we've lost." That afternoon, he went to chop firewood, expecting her to stay inside. Instead, she came out wearing his spare work shirt. "I'm not a guest here, Thomas," she said. "I'm your partner." She worked with a skill that shocked him. She couldn't match his strength with the axe, but she knew the rhythms of the work. She knew how to stack the wood so the air could dry it. She even pointed out a flaw in his technique, a way he was letting moisture get trapped, risking rot. It was a small thing, but it sent a fresh wave of unease through him. She didn't just adapt to his world. She understood it better than he did. This wasn't an escape for her. This was a return. And the secrets she was keeping were becoming a wall between them, more solid than the logs of the cabin itself. 2 weeks in, Margaret sat at the table, trying to write a letter to the matrimonial agency. "What do I tell them?" she asked. "How do you explain this?" "Tell them the truth," Thomas said, "that we're different from what we expected, but different isn't wrong." A rare, genuine smile lit up her face. "You're a wise man, Thomas Mitchell." He rode to town the next day to mail it, the letter feeling like a lie in his pocket. At the general store, the question started. "How's married life, Tom?" Jake Morrison asked, his eyes full of greedy curiosity. "Fine," Thomas said. "She's quite a woman," Jake pushed. "Not what a man expects from a mail-order bride." "She's exactly what I needed," Thomas said, his voice hard. But Jake wasn't done. He lowered his voice. "Sheriff from Boulder County was through here last week, asking questions." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "What kind of questions?" "Looking for a woman. Tall, dark hair, strong. Matched your wife's description pretty good. Said she was a person of interest in a sensitive family matter back in Chicago." Thomas's hand tightened on the counter. "Just town gossip, I'm sure," Jake said, backing off. But the damage was done. Thomas rode home, the sheriff's description echoing in his head. A person of interest, a sensitive family matter. He felt like a fool. He'd brought a fugitive into his home, into his life. When he got back to the cabin, his anger and fear were a poison in his blood. He had to know the truth. But before he could confront her, he saw a buggy coming up the trail. It was Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. Her visit wasn't a friendly one. The older woman's eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "A woman with your posture, your way of speaking," she said to Margaret over coffee. "You weren't born in a factory, dear." Margaret handled her questions with grace, but her guard was up. As Mrs. Henderson was leaving, she pulled Thomas aside. "You be careful, Tom," she whispered, her voice urgent. "That woman of yours, she's running from something big. I've seen it before. People don't just disappear into the mountains without a reason. And whatever she's running from, it's got money, and it's still looking for her." The vague fear now had a name. Money, power, and it was hunting his wife. That night, the first snow of winter began to fall, trapping them together in the tiny cabin. The secrets between them now a suffocating presence. He knew he couldn't let it go on another day. He had to know who he had married. The snow fell for days, sealing them inside the cabin. The forced intimacy was a pressure cooker. He watched her every move, searching for clues, for the truth she was so determined to hide. The warmth that had started to grow between them was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. One night, as he banked the fire, she spoke his name. "Thomas." He turned. She was sitting on the bed, the firelight catching the auburn in her hair. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "about us, about this marriage." He steeled himself. This was it. She was leaving. "I was wondering," she took a deep breath, "if we might try to make this a real marriage, in every sense." The words stunned him. After all the lies, all the secrets, she wanted this? She wanted him? "How can we?" he asked, the question tearing out of him. "When I don't even know who you are?" He saw the hurt in her eyes, but he couldn't stop. The sheriff, Margaret, Mrs. Henderson's warning, the dagger, the song you sang to the bear. None of it adds up. "Who are you?" Tears welled in her eyes, and finally the dam broke. "My name isn't Sullivan," she whispered. "It's Davenport. My father is, a very wealthy man in Chicago." She told him everything. She wasn't running from poverty. She was running from a gilded cage. Her father had arranged for her to marry a man she despised, the son of his business partner, a cruel, ambitious man named Blackwood. It was a merger, not a marriage. She was a contract to be signed. When she refused, her father had locked her away. She'd escaped with the help of a loyal servant, taking only her mother's keepsakes and the small dagger her father had once given her for protection, never imagining she might one day need it to protect herself from him. The factory stories were true, and she said, "That's where I hid. I learned to work, to be invisible. But they were still looking for me. Your letter, it wasn't just paradise. It was a place to disappear." He listened, the pieces clicking into place. The elegant speech, the inner strength, the fear. It all made sense. "I'm sorry I lied, Thomas," she whispered. "I was so afraid." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed. He looked into her tear-filled eyes and saw not a fugitive, but a survivor. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said. He reached out and touched her cheek. "You're safe here." When he kissed her this time, there were no more secrets, no more fear. It was a kiss of acceptance, of understanding, a promise. That night, they didn't just become husband and wife. They became partners, allies against the world she had left behind. But as the winter wind howled outside, Thomas knew this wasn't the end of the story. Men like her father, men like this Blackwood, they didn't just give up. They had only won a battle. The war was still coming. Spring arrived late, but it came with new life. As the snow melted, Margaret's morning sickness began. The truth was undeniable. She was pregnant. The news hit Thomas with the force of a physical blow. First came fear, cold and sharp. Then a wave of fierce, protective joy that stole his breath. A child, their child. A future he had never dared to imagine. But for Margaret, the joy was tangled with terror. "A child makes us vulnerable," she whispered one night, her hand on her still flat stomach. "It makes us easier to find." Her past was no longer a ghost story. It was a direct threat to their unborn baby. "We could leave," Thomas said, the words tasting like ash. "Go deeper into the mountains. Disappear for good." "No," Margaret said, her voice filled with that same iron resolve he'd seen at the altar. "I've spent my life running. This is our home. Our child will be born here. We don't run. We fight." Her courage was a fire that warmed him. She was right. This was their land, their life. They would stand their ground. Summer brought long days of work. They built a new fence, expanded the garden, strengthened the cabin. They were no longer just a couple. They were a family preparing for a siege. With every log he split, every nail he drove, Thomas felt like he was building a fortress. But their peace was fragile, and it shattered on a hot afternoon in July. Thomas had ridden to town for supplies. He found the place buzzing. "Haven't you heard?" Jake Morrison shouted as he walked into the store. "They're building a railroad spur, right up the valley." Thomas's stomach plummeted. "How close?" "Close enough to be your neighbor," Jake said, grinning. "It's the Blackwood Pacific Railway." Blackwood. The name was a punch to the gut. It wasn't a coincidence. He had found her. He wasn't just coming for her. He was coming to swallow their whole world. The ride home was a blur of dust and dread. He found Margaret by the stream, humming to their unborn child. He told her. She didn't cry. Her face went pale, but her eyes were hard. "I knew this day would come," she said. Just then they heard the sound of hoofbeats. A man in a fine suit, flanked by two rough-looking men, rode into their clearing. He stopped a few feet away, his cold eyes taking in the cabin, Margaret's swollen belly, and the rifle in Thomas's hands. "Mrs. Davenport, I presume," the man said, his voice smooth as poison. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. He is a reasonable man. He is prepared to offer you a generous sum for this charming piece of property, a sum that will allow you to disappear comfortably." It wasn't an offer. It was a threat. Thomas raised his rifle. "This is our home," he said. "It's not for sale." The man smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Mitchell. It's just a matter of finding the right price." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a final warning hanging in the air. Mr. Blackwood will have what is his. The war had arrived. They refused to sell, and so the siege began. Blackwood's men were clever. They didn't use open violence, not at first. They started by diverting the stream that ran by the cabin, their only source of fresh water. Thomas would spend hours each day hauling buckets from a spring a mile away. Then came the accidents. A small fire that started at the edge of their property, forcing them to spend a whole night beating back the flames. Their fences were cut, their livestock scattered. The pressure was relentless, a slow, crushing weight designed to break their will. The townspeople, once friendly, now turned away. Blackwood had promised them jobs, prosperity. A new town would spring up around the railroad depot. Thomas and Margaret were just standing in the way of progress. They were outcasts. The isolation Thomas had once sought now felt like a prison. One morning he found their milk cow dead by the stream, a single neat bullet hole in its head. The message was clear. The accidents were over. Thomas was ready to break. "We have to leave, Margaret," he said that night, his voice raw with despair. "They'll kill us. They'll take the baby." Margaret looked at him, her face grim in the lamplight. No, she said. There is more to this than just my inheritance. There's a reason he needs me silenced. She confessed the final secret. Her father hadn't just been Blackwood's partner. He'd been the inventor of a new steel-making process that was set to revolutionize the industry. He'd kept meticulous journals, documenting everything. Blackwood, she suspected, had stolen the invention. The fire that killed my parents, she whispered. I don't think it was an accident. I think Blackwood murdered them to get my father's journals. The horror of it settled over Thomas. This wasn't just about money. It was about murder. Where are the journals? He asked. I don't know. My father hid them, but I know he kept a second, secret office in Denver. Thomas knew what he had to do. You'll be a target if you stay here alone, he said. Go to Mrs. Henderson's. She'll protect you. Margaret refused, but he was insistent. I need to know you and the baby are safe. I'm going to Denver. I'm going to find those journals. He rode out before dawn, leaving his pregnant wife in the care of the only person he could trust. The 20-mile ride to town felt like 1,000. He left Margaret with Mrs. Henderson, who, despite her fear, took her in without a second's hesitation. As Thomas boarded the train to Denver, he looked back at the mountains. He had come here seeking solitude. Now he was leaving to fight a war, armed with nothing but a desperate hope that a dead man's words could save the family he loved. Denver was a chaotic mess of noise and smoke, a world away from his mountain silence. Following a faded address from one of her father's old letters, Thomas found the building. It was a rundown warehouse in the dirtiest part of the city. The second office was hidden behind a false wall in a dusty storage room. It was exactly as her father had left it, and in a locked box under the floorboards he found them. Dozens of journals filled with his elegant script. Thomas spent the night reading by the light of a single lantern. The story that unfolded was worse than Margaret had ever imagined. Blackwood had been systematically cheating her father for years. The final entries were frantic, filled with fear. Her father knew Blackwood was planning to steal his invention. He knew his life was in danger. The very last entry was dated the day before the fire. It read, Blackwood is a monster. He will stop at nothing. I have hidden the final formulas and the proof of his crimes with M. I pray she understands their importance. They are her only protection. With M, with Margaret. But she didn't have them. Thomas searched the office again, tearing it apart. Nothing. Defeated, he sat among the scattered papers. Then his eyes fell on the photograph of Margaret's mother he'd brought with him for luck. He remembered Margaret's words. She was strong. Beauty fades. Strength endures. He looked closer at the picture frame. It was thicker than it needed to be. He pried open the back. Tucked inside was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. It was a letter from her father. My dearest Margaret, it began, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Blackwood has taken everything, but he does not have the key, the final formulas, the signed confessions from his other victims, the deeds he forged. All of it is safe. Remember the song your mother always sang when storms were coming? The melody is the combination. The location is where your heart has always been happiest. Your strength is your inheritance. Use it. The song, the combination to a safe. But where? Where her heart has always been happiest. Their small farm outside the city, the one they lost after the fire. It had to be there. But Blackwood would have torn that place apart looking for it. It didn't make sense. Then another memory hit him. The wrapped bundle she'd brought on the train, the one she handled like gold. My mother's things, she'd said, her wedding dress. He raced to the train station. He had to get back. The proof wasn't in a safe. It was with Margaret. It had been with her the whole time. But as he boarded the train, he saw a familiar face on the platform, one of Blackwood's thugs. They knew he was in Denver. They had followed him. He was trapped on a moving train, and he was racing back toward the danger, not away from it. The journey back was a nightmare. Thomas knew he was being watched. He couldn't get off. He couldn't send a warning. He was a rat in a trap, and the train was speeding him right toward the exterminator. When the train finally pulled into the station, he saw him. Blackwood himself standing on the platform, flanked by a half-dozen of his men. The trap was sprung. Thomas thought about running, but where would he go? He got off the train, his hand on the small pistol he kept hidden in his coat. "Mr. Mitchell," Blackwood said, his smile like a shark's, "I'm so glad you could join us. You've saved me the trouble of hunting you down. Now I believe you have something of mine." Before Thomas could react, two men grabbed him, disarming him and forcing him onto a horse. They rode hard, not toward the town, but toward his valley, toward the cabin, toward Margaret. When they arrived, the clearing was terrifyingly silent. The door to the cabin was open. "Margaret!" Thomas screamed. Blackwood laughed. "She's safe. For now. We had a little chat while you were away. She's a stubborn woman, just like her father." They dragged Thomas inside. Margaret was tied to a chair, Mrs. Henderson beside her. Margaret's eyes were blazing with fury. "You won't get away with this," she spat. "Oh, I already have," Blackwood said. "All I need is what your father stole from me." He turned to Thomas. "The journals. Where are they?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas lied. Blackwood nodded to one of his men, who backhanded Thomas across the face. "Let's try again. You went to Denver for a reason. You found his office. You found the journals." He then looked at Margaret. "I tore that farmhouse apart years ago. I never found his safe. He told me he'd hidden his work, but he never told me where. Your daughter, however, was more helpful." He gestured to her trunk, which was broken open on the floor. Her mother's things were scattered everywhere. Her mother's wedding dress lay in a heap. "A beautiful dress," Blackwood sneered. "So much heavier than it looks. All those pearls sewn into the hem, almost like they were hiding something." He pulled a small, leather-bound book from his pocket, the final formulas. "He was a sentimental fool, your father, hiding his life's work in his wife's wedding dress. Now there's just one last thing, the combination." He grabbed Margaret by the hair. "Sing it." Margaret stared at him, her face a mask of defiance. "Never." "Fine," Blackwood said, pulling out his pistol and pointing it at Thomas's head. "Perhaps your husband can persuade you." Thomas looked at Margaret. He saw the terror in her eyes, but also the strength. "Don't do it, Margaret," he said. Blackwood cocked the hammer. "Last chance. Sing the song." Just then, a shot rang out. Not from inside the cabin, but from the trees. One of Blackwood's men outside crumpled to the ground. Everyone froze. Then another shot, and a voice boomed from the forest. "Get away from my neighbors, Blackwood." It was Jake Morrison, and he wasn't alone. The townspeople, armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, were emerging from the woods. Mrs. Henderson had sent a boy for help the moment she saw Blackwood riding up the trail. The people who had shunned them, who had turned their backs, had seen Blackwood's true, violent colors, and they had chosen a side. They had chosen to fight. Blackwood, seeing the tables had turned, grabbed Margaret, using her as a shield. "It's over," he screamed, dragging her toward the door. "Let me go, or she dies." But he underestimated her. With a powerful twist, Margaret drove her elbow into his ribs. He gasped, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all the time Thomas needed. He launched himself at Blackwood, tackling him through the open doorway. The two men crashed into the dirt, a desperate, brutal tangle of fists and fury. The final battle for the valley, for their family, for their future, had come down to this. The fight was savage. Thomas was fueled by love and rage, but Blackwood was driven by a cornered animal's desperation. They rolled in the dirt. The fate of the valley decided with every blow. Finally, Thomas got the upper hand, his hands closing around Blackwood's throat. Just as he was about to end it, he felt Margaret's hand on his shoulder. "He's not worth it," she said, her voice steady. "Let the law handle him." At that moment, the sheriff and his deputies came riding into the clearing, led by the boy Mrs. Henderson had sent. It was over. The journals Thomas found, combined with the formulas Blackwood had in his pocket, were more than enough. Justice, slow but sure, had finally come to the valley. The story became a local legend. The railroad was eventually built, but it was rerouted around their land. A new town did spring up, a town built not on greed, but on the courage of its people. Margaret, using the inheritance that was rightfully hers, helped fund a school, a new church, a doctor's office. She and Thomas didn't just build a home, they built a community. Years later, Thomas stood at that same church altar, watching his own daughter, Hope, get married. Margaret stood beside him, her hand in his. The church was full of friends and neighbors. The silence he had once cherished was gone, replaced by the happy noise of a life well lived. "Remember when that was us?" Margaret whispered. Thomas smiled. "You were never that nervous." "Wasn't I?" She raised an eyebrow. "I was terrified you'd take one look at me and send me back to Chicago." "Never," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "From the first moment I saw you, you were exactly what I needed." As the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of golden rose, Thomas sat on the porch of their expanded cabin. Hope and her new husband were there, along with their other two children, Daniel and Catherine. The air was filled with laughter. He thought about the letter he'd written all those years ago. "I don't need beauty," he'd written, "just kindness." He looked at his wife, her face lined with laughter and love, her hair streaked with silver. "I was half right," he said to her, his voice quiet. "I got the kindness, but I got the beauty too. It just took me a while to learn how to see it." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "We were both looking for the wrong thing," she said. "We thought we were looking for a spouse, but we were really looking for a home." He looked at his family at the valley spread out before them, peaceful and thriving. He had sent a letter asking for a wife and had received the whole world in return. A world built not on chance, but on a choice. A choice to face down the storm together. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you're brave enough to say, "I do," to a future you can't yet see.